Okay, so this bridges over from your greenhouse technical course where we talked about spray equipment. In this lesson in the crops course, I want to introduce you to pesticide application um, and some of the things that go along with that. And obviously, safety is a big part of it. I have borrowed from the OMAFRA course material for this, and this would be a good time for me to tell you that I will be putting an announcement out shortly, indicating how you can go about getting your pesticide license. And I have secured a discount for you guys as students. Normally, we would have a Saturday course on campus. We can't do that, so it's an online course. But I need to set up a sign-up sheet on Google, and then those that apply, I would notify OMAFRA and the University of Guelph people, and they would apply the correct discount and then bill you. So it's a pretty good deal. It takes you a while to take the course. The license is really important because it distinguishes you from others when you're applying for jobs. Okay, so this is basically a summary, a real superficial summary of what you would learn in that entire day. Okay, so obviously this is all about preventing crop loss, right? That's our goal. No one sprays because they enjoy it. It's not a fun pastime. It's something you have to do. And if you don't, there are always crop losses. That's just a fact. You can't get away from that. So bio programs are obviously very effective, and they have greatly reduced how much we spray. But has it eliminated spraying? No, not if you want to prevent crop losses. Okay. So what are the components of effective spraying? So we're going to do a little bit of math today. So obviously the dose has to be correct, right? How much are you actually applying to the plants or the insects? You have to use the correct delivery method. Some insecticides are spray only, some are drench only, as you'll see in today's example. Is it uniform? That is really, really important. And if you're spraying by hand, that comes from skill and practice. But uniformity is absolutely critical for success. If you spray whip across a tall bunch of plants and you don't try to penetrate into the leaves, you're not controlling all the bugs or the fungal infection. You're just covering a part of it. So the bugs will survive and thrive where you didn't cover with the spray. So uniformity is really, really critical. Then managing resistance, this gets a little more nuanced. Every insecticide has what's called a mode of action, and they belong to a group number, group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They don't go much past 10. But those groups, those chemicals are grouped together to help the farmer understand what type of chemical activity is happening with that insecticide or fungicide. Because if you use the same chemical all the time, you end up with resistance. And so we need to rotate chemicals from different group numbers to manage resistance. Switching from a chemical to another chemical that uses the same mode of action will not help you avoid resistance. This is something where a lot of farmers fall apart. Obviously, safe application, which right, minimizing exposure for the sprayer, the operator, and that's of course suitable PPE. I won't spend a lot of time on that. You'll get that with your COVID. I think we're all pretty good at that. And I mentioned this in the technical class, fast enough to complete the job. Sometimes we underestimate how long it takes to get the spray job done. And so if you have the wrong equipment and it's taking too long, you're not going to be successful. This is a hydraulic sprayer. This is the workhorse of your typical greenhouse. Maybe not the big veggie greenhouses, but in a lot of farmhouses, this thing, you wheel it down the aisle. There's a spool of maybe 100 or 200 feet of hose, and out you go and spray and then wind it back. If you're lucky, there's an electric rewind, but most often there's not. And this is your tank. These are usually 100 liters for the ornamental greenhouses. That's pretty standard. Sometimes they're 150 or even 200, but 100 is pretty common. That's really important for your math, right? 100 liters. Got to remember that. Here we have a typical hydraulic sprayer in a greenhouse, an ornamental greenhouse, and the farmer or employee is spraying some Boston ferns. It looks like they're on some very simple benches, but you know, this is a common experience here. You've got a raincoat on, you're wearing rubber nitrile gloves that are chemical impervious, you've got a respirator. This should really be a full face. I think it is actually, there's a visor there, so it's a full face clear mask with a respirator with cartridges on it, and those have to be certified for organic chemicals. And if you want to get real fancy, the cuffs are folded up on here, and on your gloves, the cuffs are folded the other way, so that liquids can't run up in your sleeves if you raise your arm. Like for example, in this position here, the liquids could run down the sleeve into your arm. So we got to be careful about all those sorts of things. So with spraying, there are a lot of laws, and I think that makes sense. First of all, it's for providing safety for you, the operator. It's providing safety for the consumer, and it's providing safety for the environment. So the laws are important for you to follow. Everything you do in the greenhouse is documented, and you get inspected. And if you're undergoing activities that are illegal, you're fined. I've seen farms get fined up to $10,000 for using the wrong pesticides on their crops. So it does happen. So pesticides, remember this for your quiz and your midterm, pesticides encompasses insecticides, acaricides, which is for mites, and fungicides. So that all falls under the category of pesticides, anything that's a pest, right? When we look at the label, this is where we see our instructions if you want to stay within the law. So the label, often these things, this is actually maybe 3 or 4 sheets, and it peels off on this edge and opens up like a book. So, and you can read the different pages that are behind it. So there you go. Try to draw this. Okay, so that's your label. Inside there is all your instructions. So you read that, and don't leave it till 5 minutes before you've got to spray to read it. Read it ahead of time. Plan your activity so that when it is time to spray, you've done everything correctly. So what do we look on the label for? What is it for? Well, first of all, it tells us if it's permissible. Just because you can buy a pesticide that looks like it'll solve your problem doesn't mean it's actually legal to use it. They are listed for specific crops. So you have to make sure your crop is listed on the label. The other thing you have to look for is the pesticide permissible for a greenhouse? There's a lot of chemicals on the market that are illegal in a greenhouse. They're only for field application, for example. So you have to see that it's permissible in a greenhouse. There are some insecticides, and the example I have today is a good one, that are very toxic to aquatic environments. And so there's very strict rules about using them in proximity to surface water, and in some cases even groundwater. So if your farm drains into a pond and there's wildlife in that pond, and that pond drains into a river, you have to make sure you're not using chemicals that are toxic to the aquatic environment. Otherwise, there'd be a lot of dead animals floating in your pond, and you can get into some serious trouble. There are also limitations to how you apply the pesticide. So it may say that you have to spray, or you have to cold fog. Say the chemical is not resistant to heat, so you can't thermal fog. Maybe you have to drench it only. And often, and this applies, to chemicals that are listed across both field and greenhouse, sometimes they'll say you can or cannot use aerial application. So helicopters and airplanes, which are often spray outdoor horticultural crops like cauliflowers and potatoes, high value horticulture crops. So they use aerial applications. So a lot of times the spray mode, like drench versus spray, depends on the chemical. So in today's example coming up, it is absorbed by the roots, which tells us that it is a systemic one that we can drench. And in this case, that's the only way you can apply it. You can't spray it, you have to drench it. There may actually be limitations on how many applications you make in a year. A lot of the pesticide companies will, when you purchase it, you invariably sign into a contract that you abide by their application rules. Otherwise, they can litigate. So, for example, if you apply a chemical 6 times a year and the label says you can only apply it twice, they can come after you because if you're over applying it, you may reduce its efficacy and there may become resistant insects or fungal species to that particular pesticide. And then you are, basically their chemical's worthless, and that's going to cost them a lot of money. So if it says no more than 2 applications a year, you have to adhere to that. And of course, your logbook, where you record your applications, will verify that. The other thing which I mentioned earlier in the slides was the group classification, right? Which identifies the mode of action of the chemical, so that we have to make sure if we're rotating chemicals to prevent resistance, we have to rotate between groups, not within, right? So that is between, not within groups. All right, not within. Hopefully that makes sense. So remember that. You're going to see that one on the midterm. Lastly, the label is very important because it gives us something called a re-entry period. That means that after you've sprayed, it tells you how long you have to wait, how many hours or days before you can re-enter the greenhouse. Now we're doing a drench example today, so there's no re-entry period. But if you're spraying and creating ultrafine water droplets, they can stay in suspension and then they can evaporate and be volatile and you can inhale those. So there's obviously health risks associated with that. So there's re-entry periods. And if you own a farm, you have to obey these so your staff are not exposed to chemicals when they come back to work, say on a Monday morning. Then there's also, and this is important, a pre-harvest interval. So all chemicals, when sprayed, break down because of things like pH, mostly because of oxygen or UV light, or sometimes even just the metabolism of the plant. So there's a useful period of time where that pesticide is effective, and then it fades away and it's gone. It breaks down into benign chemicals. So typically these are tested by the government for toxicity, and if after post-harvest, once the crop has passed the pre-harvest interval, these are for edible crops, by the way, then there can be nothing toxic remaining in the produce. Now I know we're all skeptical about that and probably have every right to be skeptical of it. That's why we push biologicals very hard in our college program. And I firmly believe that a really well implemented bio program will minimize the amount that you have to spray. I say minimize because the reality is it will not eliminate it. And that's a really important thing to come to grips with. Here's an example of Ridamil. This is the one we're going to be going through today, Ridamil Gold. It's a fungicide. So we can see here it's part of group 4. Okay, so if we're going to rotate it, we have to rotate it with a group 1, 2, or 3, or 5 fungicide, not with another group 4. So it attacks Oomycete class of fungi. So that means that it's only going after that particular type of species. So we have to make sure we're not using a fungicide that's not suitable for what we're looking for. Now there's another list with the species actually labeled, so that's a bit less confusing. The label also tells you what the active ingredient is. If you are looking up information for, say, toxicity, say you yourself are curious, if you just looked up Ridamil, it's not going to help you. You have to look up the active ingredient. So mefenoxam would be what you want to look up to see what the toxicity is. Should you be really worried or not? Now, on the face of this, I don't see a great big stop sign, so that's a good sign, right? But it does say keep out of reach of children. Mind you, that seems pretty logical. In case you're wondering, Oomycetes, this is the kingdom of fungi. I will not ask you to memorize this. But again, a lot of these slides end up, being a repository of information for you when you go out and work. So this may be helpful to you. And here we are. Look at this. Phytophthora. Does that look familiar? Here we are in the label. There's the stop sign. Big square. That's bad. So this is the more technical side of the label behind the flashy label. So there's our group 4. Here's our active ingredient, including the concentration, 480 grams per liter. And this tells us the toxicity level, which in this case is high. We move on down the label. I'm just highlighting stuff. I'm not giving the whole label. And here we see that it is toxic to aquatic organisms. So we have to be sure that we are not letting this run off into a pond. So here you see observed buffer zone specified. So it'll say in the directions how many meters away from a body of water that you have to be. So this is the list of species for various crops, but in this case, the only one that applies for us in a greenhouse is cucumbers. So this is actually for Pythium. Phytophthora is not listed under here for cucumbers. It probably would be very effective against Phytophthora. I'll tell you right now that a lot of farmers would use it for Phytophthora if they had it, because it is listed for both species, and it's already listed for Pythium, so you could say, well, I'm doing a preventative spray for Pythium, which in a sense you are, but you're also trying to be curative for Phytophthora. So that's a really good example to show you how things can get a little fuzzy in the world. The box down here, this next one, basically says that the fungicide is readily absorbed by the roots and provides protection against attack from these diseases. Okay, so this is preventative. I'll tell you right now, most fungicides are preventative. Once you have a fungal problem, it's very difficult to cure it. All you can do is hold it at bay for the rest of the crop. But the fact that it readily absorbs through the roots is really critical, because that tells us how we're going to apply it. Right? So it's not absorbing through the leaves, it's absorbing through the roots. So we're going to put it into a liquid form, and we're going to water it into the soil or the rock wool, and the plants are going to absorb it from there through the roots. Okay? Down here it says, do not apply using aerial equipment. So no helicopters or airplanes, which of course don't apply to greenhouses. But here you go. Once again, in case you're wondering, do not use as a foliar application. So now I highlighted just the cucumbers, greenhouse cucumbers component of their label. So there's not a lot of information there, but we do know that they list it for control of Pythium. And when it comes to the dose, they're pretty clear. Down in this section here, you're supposed to add 250 milliliters of Ridimil per block. Now, it's maybe not a bit clear on this. This is for propagation stage of cucumbers. So seedlings in the small cubes, not in the big slabs. So that's usually where they treat them for fungal infection, just to make sure they're healthy before we transplant them in. So you're adding 250 milliliters per block prior to transplanting. That's the part that tells you. Now, they have a range of dose, 0.075 to 1.25. So what that means for the most part is you would maybe start on the low end, and if you end up with a problem, you would shift to the higher dose to have control. Because, to be honest, it's expensive, so you want to minimize how much you're going to use. Now, in my math, I split the difference and used 1 milliliter per 10 liters. So, trying to keep it simple. A couple of rules here. Do not apply to the foliage. Make only one application per planting cycle. That's per crop. So if it's cucumbers, you do 3-4 cycles in a year, so one application per cucumber crop. Do not use in the propagation house. So that's where you're germinating your seeds. Do not apply within 21 days of harvest. This is your pre-harvest interval. So if it's 21 days before you're going to start harvesting, don't spray. Now just think about that. Just think about the logic. You've seen cucumbers grow. We've planted them. And at the college, they're now about, let's say, 4 inches long by the time we come in this week. We'll be harvesting in a week or so. So we should have stopped spraying 2 weeks ago. So really this is only for the cube stage because we are often picking fruit from transplant within 21 days. So sometimes more, sometimes 28. We're a little late, but that's just how it is. So really, it does highlight that this is for the cube stage. That's why I said it's maybe not clear, but it is implicit. Because once you start producing cucumbers, they never stop. So there's no point where you can stop spraying because you're continually harvesting. Another interesting thing, not that it really applies, because the only time we grow cucumbers in soil is in organic context. And of course, in organic, we're not going to spray. So forget that. But there are greenhouses in parts of the world where they still grow cucumbers in the soil as if it were a garden. So let's hit some of the math. Here we've got our cube. We have one with Pythium and we have one that is healthy. And we're going to figure out the math, right? So here I've copied it over. 250 milliliters of a mixture. And that mixture is this range of chemical in 10 liters of water. So we're going to pick 1 milliliter. That's what I've done over here. We're going to do 1 milliliter in 10 liters of water. That'll be our mixture. Okay? Now we know from the instructions that we're supposed to apply 250 milliliters per cucumber block. Okay? So let's say we're going to treat 20,000 blocks. Okay? So how much Ridamil? Now remember, Ridamil. I'm not asking how much mixture. I'm asking ultimately how much Ridamil. But we have to start with the mixture. So we take our 20,000 blocks and we multiply it by this 250 milliliters per block, right? Those together work out to 5 million milliliters. How do you convert from milliliters to a liter? You divide by 1,000. So take 3 zeros off. That's 5,000 liters. That's how much you need to treat 20,000 cucumber blocks. Okay? This is about a normal crop size for a propagating house, by the way, or where they make where they grow the cucumber cubes. So now we know how much mixture. Now we have to figure out how much Ridamil. And remember, it's 1 mil per 10 liters. So we solve for X. This is this formula that I keep talking about, right? So we put similar units on the bottom, liters over here, the unknown here, and then the units that we want to know here. So there's the architecture for how that always works. We know from up here that it's 1 mil per 10 liters. So here we go, 1 mil in 10 liters. And we want to know how many mils in 5,000 liters. So we solve for X. We multiply this up to this side. So 5,000 times this, which is 5,000 times 1 divided by 10. Now the liters here are on top and the liters are on the bottom. So a liter divided by a liter, they cancel. And you're left with milliliters as your unit. Okay? So that's how we know that we need 500 milliliters of Ridamil to treat 20,000 cubes. It's pretty effective. That's not a lot, right? You're going to drench 20,000 cubes with 5,000 liters, and you're only going to put half a liter of chemical in there. That's pretty efficient. All right, so moving on to delay resistance. I'm going to emphasize this again. It talks about group 4 fungicides. All right, rotate with different groups. Really, really important. It does talk about do not use Ridamil in 2 consecutive seed generations. That really doesn't apply to what we're doing. Use tank mixtures with fungicides. This is interesting. We don't often encourage tank mixtures. That means you're putting 2 chemicals together, but they save you a lot of time, and which saves you money. So it means that Ridamil is compatible with different groups, and that is really useful. So that means if you want to control resistance, or if you want to control multiple problems, or let's say prevent multiple problems, you can put 2 fungicides together into the tank and drench simultaneously. That's really helpful. Not many chemicals are compatible for tank mixes. They will say if they are not on the label. And then, of course, this is a really important step here. A lot of times people forget this in greenhouses, especially greenhouses that have good documentation and consultants. They use what's called a predictive disease model. So really all that means is that if the greenhouse records environmental conditions outside of the greenhouse for a certain number of days, then it will know that the risk of disease is high because spores are high outside the greenhouse and they could move through the vents in. So if it's been overcast and really humid for 3 or 4 days, then your predictive model will say you should spray this or drench this now to make sure you don't have a problem. And it'll save you a lot of headache and a lot of problems in the long run by doing that. It's unfortunate with some farmers, all they do is they just drench and spray on a schedule. I live next to a farmer who did that every Friday. He sprayed the same 2 chemicals. I kid you not, every Friday, the same 2 chemicals. There was resistant mites and thrips coming across our field constantly. It was a nightmare. You can't do that. You have to spray intelligently. You have to look at the climate, look at the conditions, look at the chemicals, and make the right choices. So, know how much you are spraying, right? That's another thing. Not just with the math, I'm talking in terms of what's actually coming out of your sprayer. So I want to talk briefly about calibrating a sprayer. Calibrating a sprayer should be done at the beginning of a season. So if you're an ornamental, say you clean out in the summer, you start again in the fall, that's when you're going to calibrate your sprayer. Or if you've bought some new equipment and you don't know how it works, a different spray nozzle, you're going to calibrate it. If you change a pump, lines even. So you should also become very familiar with how much liquid usually takes to cover an area in your greenhouse. That's very important. That can be done by practicing with just straight water and then going through a whole bay, which I'm going to talk about for calibration, but even if you just want to see about, is it effective coverage or not, that's a really important thing to do. I remember, for example, that our greenhouse, we could do the entire greenhouse with about 300 liters of water. So that meant that I knew exactly how much I had to mix, which was two tanks that were 2/3 full roughly with my sprayer, and that made sure I had enough to cover my crop. There were times when I ran out, which was a real pain in the butt. I did my best, and I'll admit there were times when I knew I was running low and I had, maybe one more row and I would just go quickly to cover it. But, unless I knew I had a real problem, I could maybe get away with that. But that's not generally a good idea. And it's really hard to get it just right because if you end up with, 50 liters excess, what are you going to do with that, right? Now, you can't dump it down the drain. What you have to do is you have to go back and you've got to spray on the perimeter or in areas where you didn't get, like under benches in the back corners, just to use it up. Always watch for anomalies. What that means is when you're spraying, when you go back after finishing a bay or a row, lift the lid in your tank or look at the tank sight line and see how much you've used. If it hasn't changed much and you've noticed it sounds different, you may not be spraying the same quantity. Or if there's tons missing, more than more than normal, and right off the bat you're not going to have enough to finish your bay, something's gone, maybe your nozzle's too coarse and you're spraying too much chemical. But you won't know that unless you pay attention on a regular basis to see what's going on. So we want to ensure through calibration that the correct dose of pesticide is being applied, right? Something along the lines of what is indicated on the label. So if you end up spraying below that rate, above it is usually not as much of an issue other than maybe risking burn on your crop. But if you spray below that dose, you end up with what's called a sublethal dose. And that means that insects are exposed to the chemical, but not to the point where they will kill them. And it will actually help select their offspring for resistance. You accelerate the development of resistance if you do that. And so often where you chronically don't spray enough, like maybe in the corners on the back of a row that you can't get to, that's where you start getting resistant pests. So how do you calibrate a sprayer? You spray a small area that you've measured, right? Spray properly as if you were spraying a crop with a real problem. Measure how much liquid you use, and now you know how much it takes for a given amount of area, right? So if you know that it's 100 liters for 3 bays or 25 liters a bay, you know how much liquid you need to cover your greenhouse. So in this example, we measure out 1,000 square meters, so 10 meters by 100 meters, which is, half a bay. Or a baby, that's roughly a bay, but anyways. You're gonna run the sprayer at its operating pressure as if you were spraying the chemical, and you're gonna use the spray pattern and nozzle you would as if you were gonna spray, whether it's fine or coarse, wide or narrow. And you're gonna spray that area at a steady pace, evenly covering the crop. And then after that, you know exactly how much was required to spray 1,000 square meters. So that's how you calibrate your equipment. Then you go back and you adjust your chemicals to the volume that you need. If it says, for example, in this case here, the chemicals listed as kilograms per hectare, you have to convert that to your application. If it's liters per hectare, you have to convert that to your application. Sometimes they have acres, sometimes they have square feet. It's all over the map. Some of these companies are American, some are Canadian. So you have to be able to do some unit conversion there. But you definitely have to know how many liters to start with, right? How many liters? Is it, 500 liters to do your farm? You need to know how much. And then you can figure out, okay, if I'm doing 500 liters to cover my 1 hectare farm, I know how many kilograms or liters I'm going to need. Okay, so if you're going to figure out how much you're going to spray in your crop, you need to know how much for a given area. Let's say we know that the rate on the package is saying 1 kilogram per hectare. That's 10,000 square meters, but we're only spraying 1,000 square meters, right? That's our calibration area. We need to know how much we're going to add for that area. And again, there's solve for X. We don't know how much we're going to add in grams for 1,000 square meters, but we know there's 1,000 grams, which is 1 kilogram, in 10,000 square meters. Solve for X. This multiplies up. The square meters cancel. You're left with grams, and it ends up being 100 grams. So you've calibrated your sprayer. You know how much liquid it takes to cover a given area, and you know exactly how many grams to achieve your kilogram per hectare rate. Let's say it's liters. Let's say you're told it's 100 liters per hectare. Okay, same thing. So we're spraying for 1,000 square meters. Well, we know it's 100 liters in 10,000 square meters. How many liters in 1,000 square meters? It's the exact same formula every time, right? So you're going to multiply this up. The meters cancel. You're left with liters. Multiply it all out. Divide by 10,000. You get 10 liters. So you need 10 liters to spray 1,000 square meters in your calibration. Because we're calibrating based on an area, not just a liquid content, right? I mentioned this in the technical class. I briefly want to go over it again because it's really important. I talked about all the different adjuvants, but wetting agents are probably the most important. This picture says it all. Here we have a plant with its trichomes on the leaves, and look at the water. It's beading. If you're applying a pesticide, how is that going to get into the plant? It's not. It's going to dry up and form crystals on the exterior, and you actually will get very little absorption into the leaf if it's a foliar spray. So by adding a wetting agent, the water loses its surface tension and it spreads evenly over the entire surface area, and you end up giving a dose to the epidermis of the leaf. So it's super, super critical. The other thing that's important about it is sometimes we're spraying the bugs. It's a contact pesticide, not a residual or translaminar. It's one that actually has to contact the insects. Well, if you look at an insect, they're covered in hairs, and that's not by accident. They're covered in hairs because water beads on the hairs. So you end up not getting lethal doses on the insects, and your spray efforts are for nothing. So again, wetting agents are really important. So wetters, spreaders, surfactants, they all do the same thing. They reduce water tension, allowing water, preventing water from forming droplets or beads. It just spreads evenly. I think I mentioned that fancy car washing chemicals you can buy for your hot rod. Actually, all they do is they put wetting agents in the final rinse, and then when you rinse your car, it dries like an even sheet. There's no beads, so there's no droplets, and it doesn't leave spots. That's exactly how jet dry works in your dishwasher. In a commercial greenhouse, especially in the vegetables, often the spray tanks are in a central location. There's too much liquid to be dragging a barrel around. So they have a large tank area, and you set your pressure, so 450 psi, whatever, which is pretty common. And then the chemicals go out into the greenhouse, and then you can kind of you can hook up to different places along the bay with your robot or your line, and then spray with that without having to carry all that equipment. It's pretty handy. This is just another look at the spray tanks over here on the side. Stainless steel. There's a sight level here. You can see how much water has been used from the tank. It's just a clear tube that's vertical. Of course, I've drawn all over it. So if you go and you spray a bay, you come back and you'll see how much water have you used, and that's how you can calibrate. And so you would be checking this regularly while it's spraying your crops. They're also storing their fertilizer in this area. It's the chemical room. This is a hand sprayer, pretty primitive, but this is sort of a less sophisticated tomato greenhouse. It's a low arching poly. Here the person is just dragging that thing manually. Now I show this picture because a lot of farmers are mavericks, right? Look at the PPE. Well, he managed to put the gloves on, but he's wearing a short sleeve shirt and shorts. No respirator, no mask. This poor fella, he may feel like a real macho person, but he won't feel so macho when he's got cancer when he's 50 years old or 60 years old. That sucks. So I'm not saying that cancer is only caused by that, but you certainly want to minimize your risks. And you're in agriculture, this is a risk. So you have to take it seriously and wear your PPE. If you follow the rules, you don't have to worry. It's not a problem. As far as spraying evenly, Matt has some of these cards. We're hoping to use them this term so you can practice spraying in the greenhouse. They are a card that has an ink that reacts to water, and you can see you can use it to assess how evenly you're spraying. So this person has put it behind a tomato leaf. They've clipped it to the back. They go through the crop and they want to see how much of the spray is curled around to the back side of the leaf, because Mother Nature is sneaky and a lot of the bugs hide on the back side of the leaf. Think of thrips and whitefly. They're almost always on the back side of the leaf. So here the card has been placed behind some fruit, and you can see there's a definite shadow behind the tomatoes and lots of water contacting on the sides. So you know that there's no pesticide being applied on the back side of this particular fruit cluster. Sometimes when farmers are trying new equipment, so these are nozzles on the spray gun, so they're dual flat fan, 4 cone fans, 1 flat fan, 1 upside down, behind the fruit. You know, they're doing a matrix trial, different combinations to see what's giving the most effective spray. And they're putting these cards out to give them an idea. And you can see that the 4 hollow cone with upside down seems to work fairly well. But the best they're getting is with just straight down flat fans spraying sideways into the crop. And they probably create enough turbulence that they shoot through the leaves, and that turbulence curls around and catches the leaves from behind. Not to mention when you're going down the rows, if you shoot through, you're hitting the back side of the crop on the other side, as well as the side facing you. And when you go down the next row, you shoot through the leaves to the back side of the other crop. So a lot of this is really thinking in three-dimensional space. So even coverage is absolutely critical, making sure we have a uniform dose in our leaves so you don't end up with sublethal doses, which of course will lead to resistance. It's also because these chemicals are expensive. A lot of new chemicals that we use in greenhouses are low toxicity water-based chemicals that are very expensive because their lifespan is a lot less. Old school oil soluble pesticides are still very effective to this day, but they're incredibly toxic. Where modern day pesticides have an expected lifespan of 10 years in the market before they're utterly useless. But they have the benefit of being low toxicity. But even coverage is always important. And using the right equipment is important for success. And of course, be responsible with how you spray.